This is Karen with New Cleveland Radio, and it's time for Avoid the Maze. You are special. And I think I have a very special guest today because she has a lot of concerns, like many of us do in this world, and especially parents who are bringing up their kids in a world that um, may not feel as secure as it once did. She started out her bio on Podmatch, which grabbed me right away. And what it says is, so are you worried about the climate crisis? My answer is absolutely. But in addition to the climate crisis, so many other crises that our children are coming, um, that are going to have to grow up with. And hopefully we can start to change that. And I know my guest, Bridget, has created a book, a handbook as well, turning fear into action. So I'm going to just turn it over to you, Bridget. Tell us your story and what you're doing and how we can all get involved.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So I guess to give you a bit of the background, I have been an environmental reporter for a long time. I was mostly focused on food systems, and so not really, talking to chefs about restaurants they were opening, but more talking to them about specific ingredients or talking to farmers. And so I was kind of like immersed in that world of reporting. And then when I had my own child in 2018, I started to kind of expand on that a lot to think about all of the other ways the environment and what's happening in the climate crisis is kind of impacting kids. And I was really looking for something that I could read or some sort of guide. And there are lots of things then about like how do we talk to kids about the climate crisis, but that wasn't really my concern. I think just because my background was a communicator, so I wasn't necessarily worried about how I would have those conversations, but I was very curious about just like the day to day, like how do we live? Like what are the best ways to raise a child who's going to be able to deal with the future impacts of the climate crisis. And because I was already kind of having these conversations with farmers and chefs, I started to ask them more about like their kids and what they do in their own homes. Like, are they vegetarian? Do they eat plant-based foods? How do they think about food waste? And that kind of sort of expanded to talking to all sorts of different people who are kind of working not necessarily, I spoke to some climatologists, but not necessarily working in like environmental science, but also like fashion designers and people who travel to kind of get their tips on what they did in their own life. And so that kind of became the book.
So as a mother, my boys are grown, they're young men. Um, and I tried very desperately to make sure that I was making my own baby food in the beginning. I thought
Mhm.
I was this great mom doing it. The problem was that once they moved off of the baby food and they started going to daycare, they saw the kids eating things that they had never tasted before. And I actually was told at a daycare what a bad mother I was because my child had never had a Twinkie. And,
Whoa, that's
um,
crazy.
yeah. And my first reaction was, well, if I eat a Twinkie, I put on 20 pounds. Okay. Just even
Hmm.
just in my brain. And so I was trying to keep my kids away from what we now call junk food. And I found that the more I tried, the more difficult it became. And so I became one of those mothers who just started following what other parents were doing. Um, Interestingly enough, both of my boys eat very well today. Junk food is something that it's a treat, but then they realize when they treat themselves with it, they're not even happy. So obviously, I instilled something,
Oh, yeah.
but again, it's so difficult as a mom not to let your kids have what we call junk food. So, how do you tell your son, who's now what, 7?
Daughter, she's
Okay.
yeah, she's 6.5, but yes, yeah.
Okay. So she sees her other friends probably eating gummy bears and everything.
Right. Luckily, I would say is like nowadays there are so many other options. I think like, gummy bears or like any sort of fruit snacks are a great example. We have a great zero waste grocery store in our town, and they actually sell like organic gummy bears
Okay.
as like a fruit snack, and then you can buy them in bulk, so you just buy as many as you need. So I have found that there are often alternatives, but I also sort of I don't necessarily worry about those day-to-day things. I try to think about it like overall as the whole of like, okay, maybe you had some junk food today, but how much junk food did you have overall? Or like, for instance, we know flying is really bad for the planet, right? Well, that doesn't mean I'm never going to get on a flight, but I do try to make like conscious decisions about how often I'm flying. But I think there's a balance to be found in all of it. And I think like as you found, like you do notice that your kids listen, and you're kind of instilling more values than you probably realize. I have a lot of conversations with my daughter about plastic. And so when she came home from the Earth Day in April from her school, and they had made like a necklace with plastic beads, which I think was supposed to be like teaching them about like pattern making. And she had said, I did ask the teacher about why this was made of plastic and why there wasn't something else we were using. So I think you do start to see that they are listening.
I think it's interesting. I'm glad you brought up plastic because when I think about plastic, I didn't think how dangerous it really was. And I was at my GI specialist in December, and we were talking about the fact that I had been working so hard for the past year to try to lose weight. And just out of the blue, he said, "So, how often do you use your microwave?" And I told him, he said, "And what do you put the food on?" And I said, sometimes a plastic plate. He said, "How often are you using plastic?" And we started talking about this to the point that I realized I was using it more than I ever thought it was. And he said, "We're going to try something." So I don't want you to use plastic in your microwave. And in fact, if you can use your oven or your stove to heat things up, that's what I want you to do. And I want you to do this exclusively for 30 days. And I did. And I lost 7 pounds.
Wow.
And I realized if I stay away from the chemicals, which
Hmm.
was in the plastic, and the plastic was getting into my food.
Right.
And he said to me, "It's going to take a while to get this out of your system, but we're going to do it." And so now I tell everybody, if you're heating something up, you know, how about a glass plate? Okay.
Right.
How about on a
Yeah.
napkin? Okay. Um, and I know it doesn't pertain to everybody, but these are things that typically your doctors don't even come up with to try to figure out.
Right.
So,
Yeah, I think, I mean, good of your doctor for being able to think about that as like just a lifestyle change that you could make that would potentially have like huge effects. And I think like it is, people ask me all the time, like, well, what should I be using instead of plastic, or should I throw away like my plastic Tupperware containers? And I always say like, no, they're fine to use until like they're broken and need to be
right,
replaced, because we don't need to create more trash. But like when you're ready to do that, then I would look for something like glass or like stainless steel, for kids' lunch or even for my own lunch when I'm going into the office. Like I try to use like stainless steel with a silicone lid. Like you can't heat that up in the
right.
microwave, but yeah, for something cold, it's great.
So your daughter has picked up on some of the information that you are sharing with her. Does she have a fear of any of these things? Because I love the name of your handbook, Turning Fear
Right.
into Action.
I think she's still kind of young to understand like the bigger effects or the bigger impacts. Like we haven't really gotten to that part of our conversation. We've talked a little bit about like, how like the earth is sick and there's different things that we can do to make it feel better, just like when she has a temperature or cold, or and that there are things that we do that can make it feel worse, but we haven't really no, we haven't really had those conversations yet. They're definitely coming because, I mean, and this will change because again, she's 6, but she says something like, I always want to live in our house. And our house will not survive climate change. Like eventually the water in our where we live in Connecticut will be too high. It might not happen in my lifetime, but it will definitely happen within hers. So it is that kind of knowledge of we are going to lose things and how you start to have those conversations.
Now, I have an acquaintance who moved to Florida, and her grandchildren went down to visit, and they basically said the same thing, oh, grandma, when you're gone, I have to have your house. And she said, I don't think my house will be here. And they said, why are you taking it with you? And she goes, no, I think the ocean is going to take it. And she didn't realize that she was talking to how young they were in saying this.
Mhm.
And they didn't say anything right away, but every day when they'd go outside, they kept looking for water. They kept thinking the ocean was going to creep up and take the house away.
Yeah.
So I think it is important that we understand that some of these things are a very good possibility they're going to happen. And we have to prepare for them, but we don't have to be frightened at this moment in time. We just have to plan ahead. Like we have to plan ahead to plant the right foods and to eat the right
Right.
foods.
Right. I think anybody who likes to garden sees that. Like I just planted a bunch of hydrangea plants over the weekends, and my goal is that eventually they'll be big enough that they create kind of this like hidden nook in the garden, right? But that's going to take like a decade at
Yeah.
least. You're doing it thinking ahead.
So, what is your mission today? How are you getting it across other than to your child and your immediate family? How do people learn some of the techniques that probably are in your handbook?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much information that's out there. I think there's also a lot of fear, and I think people are often afraid to start to do something. So I like to say, like, pick what you're interested in. If you're big at cooking, like, figure out what you can do in your kitchen to kind of reduce your climate footprint. Or if, you love being outside and taking hikes, like, think about some of the ways that you can make that area better. I do have a monthly newsletter, so I like write there where I tend to try to share like a mix of essays, but also very like practical tips.
So, there are many people who are saying, if I change my lifestyle, boy, that's, I'm too old or, oh, it's going to be very costly. Um, my youngest son had gallbladder surgery 2 years ago. His gallbladder almost burst on him. He had no idea what was going on, had no idea that he even had a digestive problem. Um, After he had his gallbladder out, the doctor basically said to him, well, don't eat fried foods. Some foods might bother you. You test it out. And it just was 2 years. And um, about a week or so ago, he called me and he just was feeling really, really sick. He said, I feel like I did when my gallbladder was bad. And I said, well, then you may have to go to the emergency room. And because he's 700 miles away from me, so it's not like I
Hmm.
can
Yeah, they
go
can't do
over and,
anything.
check him out. He doesn't have any friends in his apartment complex, so it's not like he could go knock on the door, or he probably could have, but he didn't feel comfortable. So he said, just stay on the phone with me a little bit. You know, I'm going to take, something for indigestion and see if that works. And when it didn't, I said, you need to call 911. You're by yourself. You don't know what's wrong. And as it turns out, when the EMS got there, they walked him through some things. And this one EMS guy was very knowledgeable on gallbladders. And the first thing he said to him was, what did you eat tonight? And he said, I had raw shellfish.
Mm.
Said, did you make it yourself? He said, yeah. He said, I bought it at the store. I came home, I cleaned it, I rinsed it. He said, I may not have rinsed it well enough. If there were sand or pebbles in there, that's probably what's going on. And so they checked him out. He didn't have to go to the emergency room, as it turns out, because this guy, and within a couple of hours, my son really was okay. But he then got very upset. Why hasn't he been told what to look for? But there's a lot to look for, isn't there, in all the natural stuff?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's so much to look for. That's why I think it's really helpful to just think about, what you're most engaged with. But then I also think, and part of there's one of the early chapters of my book talks about this, about how we kind of evaluate information because there's also so many different conflicting things. You can basically find anything to meet your personal belief system if you try hard enough, right? So kind of it talks a little bit about like how do we evaluate where this information is coming from and find trustworthy sources.
Now, do you go out and speak to the community about?
Yeah, I've done a number of talks. I've done some events elsewhere. My town has a big eco fair in April, and so I'm one of the organizers for that.
So a lot of us don't even understand, even if we're gardening, okay, what are there good plants to plant? Are there good seeds? If I were to go plant, let's say, tomatoes in my garden, which I'm not allowed to because I live in a condo, and so we can't have any fresh vegetables growing. But I probably would go to the local garden store and say, which of these tomato plants, are the hardiest. I wouldn't think about if there's one that's better for me or not. Is there a way to find out?
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to something like tomatoes, really just planting anything is a good thing to do. Like anything is better than grass for the most part. But, going to a local garden store is great because they'll be able to tell you, oh, well, this is like something that's native to this area. So it's probably going to be like a little hardier. It's going to do better. And then, some of it just comes down to like, I will try to find like tomatoes that are organic because I don't want the pesticides on them or something from like a local farm, which again, if you're going to a local garden store, like they're going to be able to tell you which is more conventionally grown and or if anything has come in locally.
So when you buy organic, in theory, there's no pesticides been used, correct?
Well, no, that's actually a common misconception.
Okay.
Organic, you can still use pesticides on them. They're just what they consider been considered natural or organic pesticides. So they're not the chemical synthetic ones that we think of more with the conventional farming.
Okay. So there is a natural pesticide that can be used that's not going to
Right.
hurt us. Okay. When you're buying other vegetables that are not organic, is there a way to clean them in such a way that we can get rid of the pesticides?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anything is ever a sure bet. I always like to use like white vinegar, which also if you do like half white vinegar, half water, for your like any sort of berries and like let it soak for 10 minutes, I find that it also helps keep your berries fresher longer, which is a plus, because sometimes they get mushy so
Yep.
quickly. But the Environmental Working Group, EWG, they also have a great list where they kind of go through every year and they update the produce in terms of how much pesticide like residue might be on it. And so that is something that like if you can't buy all organic, that's great to look at that list and be like, oh, well, berries, for instance, I probably do want to buy organic. Bananas, if I'm peeling them, like, probably not as much of an issue.
Well, I'm going to be shopping totally different, I think, from
For
this
your
point
personal
forward.
health, I will say. I mean, it's better overall for the planet if you're buying the things without, and for the people who are growing the food as well. But I realize it's not always
Exactly.
possible.
So we can then, we don't have to go out and buy those 16-ounce bottles of um, fruit cleaner. We can make our own.
No,
With
yeah,
that.
yeah, I would make
Okay.
your own.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a friend who buys a case of the cleaner, and it's like, she'll tell me that, I've spent $50 on all this stuff. And it's like, I don't eat that much fruit and vegetables to have $50 stocked in my house, but knowing that I can use white vinegar and water, hey, that's great. And you say, well, keep my berries fresher, right?
Yeah, that's really why I started to do it. Because there's nothing worse than opening your fridge to find mushy berries.
So, in addition to writing this book, where do you see yourself going with the information as it becomes more widespread? And we really need to take charge of things. If we don't, your daughter and her children um, aren't going to have much around for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a very tough question these days in the US just because of the current administration. So I think that what I have been doing is focusing very much on my local community and what like I can do there. There are things where like last fall, the town next to me had a toy swap around Christmas time where they asked people to bring like a toy and then you could basically shop for new toys. And the
Right.
idea was is that like, you're getting your Christmas shopping done or your holiday shopping done. And so things like that that you can like put on. I want to try to do one with my child's school in this fall that will be like Halloween costume swaps. Like I think there's all different things that people can do locally. Um, One of the chapters in my book talks a lot about things that high school students have done across the country. And one of those things was getting their schools to invest in solar panels. So that's something that can be done on a larger scale, but still within your local community.
I love that. Starting within your home and then within your community is probably the best way for us to make any positive changes. Um, and I really like that. How can we find your handbook?
Yeah, so it's available really wherever you normally get your like books. A lot of independent stores have it. It's also on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. On my website, Shirvell.com has a link to it along with my newsletter and all of that information.
Well, all that will be in the show notes. And I'm hoping that those who are listening maybe can start coming up with some ideas how we can all do something that is positive for the environment. Um, I know that there's today, I'm having a hard time going outside because we're getting a lot of the smoke
Mm.
from the Canadian fires. And a couple years ago, I would have just ignored it. I would have said, it's no big deal. But I realize what it does to my health when I go out there. And so, let's come up with things that we can do. Number one, to stay healthy ourselves, but to help others as well. And I think we should start by getting your handbook, turning fear into action, and we can all take some action.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank
I
you.
will just say that like one of the best things for people to do is also just talk about it. Like talk about the climate crisis and how you're feeling, right? Like how you're feeling about not being able to go outside because of the wildfire smoke. I think we really don't talk about it enough with our friends and family and neighbors.
Well, I did write a letter to my congressman. So not that he can stop the fire, but I wanted him to understand that we have to do something about all these fires that we've been having and how it affects all of us. So that was the first thing I did this morning
Yeah,
when
that's
I went
great.
outside and started coughing. So I get it.
Mm, yeah.
Thank you so much, Bridget. It's
Yeah,
been
thank
wonderful
you.
having
All
you on. We'll talk to you
right,
soon.
thank you. All
Bye
right,
bye now.
bye.